Welcome to the Michael Shermer Show. I'm your host, Michael Shermer. My guest today is Suzanne Nossel, Dare to Speak, Defending Free Speech for All. She has quite the biography, and this is one of the most qualified people I think I've ever talked to on this subject. She's currently the CEO of PEN America, the leading civil rights, human rights, and free expression organization. She's a leading voice on free expression issues in the United States and globally, writing and being interviewed frequently for national and international media outlets. Her prior career spanned government service and leadership roles in the corporate and nonprofit sector. For example, she served as the COO of Human Rights Watch and executive director of Amnesty International USA. During the first term of the Obama administration, Nossel served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for International Organizations, where she led U.S. engagement in the United Nations and multilateral institutions on human rights and humanitarian issues. During the Clinton administration, Nossel was deputy to the U.S. Ambassador for U.S. Management and Reform at the U.S. Mission to the United Nations, where she was the lead negotiator in settling U.S. arrears to the world body. During her corporate career, Nossel served as Vice President of U.S. Business Development for Bertelsmann, and as Vice President for Strategy and Operations for the Wall Street Journal. Okay, in other words, she's huge. She's a magna cum laude graduate of both Harvard College and Harvard Law School. So to say she's qualified would be an understatement. In her book and in our conversation, we discuss to what extent hate speech is a form of violence, what it means to incite violence with words, and why the standards are very high to prove that. Libel and slander, rudeness and how we all self-censor, private versus government restrictions on speech, social media tech companies and censorship, and what the government should or should not do about it, call-out culture and cancel culture, how to apologize for wrong or hurtful speech, free expressionist speech, such as flag burning and Madonna's videos, and to what extent liberals or conservatives are more or less censorious, corporate controls on speech, cultural appropriation of speech, the euphemism treadmill, compelled speech, and finally we talk about to what extent colleges and universities are required or not to invite certain kinds of speakers, and once they're invited, whether or not they should be deplatformed based on the response of the audience. Talk about the heckler's veto and that extent. Obviously, she's critical of all that. She says, and she outlines in the book exactly what you should do if you want to protest somebody whose views you don't agree with without silencing their speech. In any case, it was a very insightful conversation, particularly since I don't know that much about the legal aspects of free speech. So much of that does depend on understanding how the law treats these things like libel and slander and incitement to violence. So we get into all that. All right. If you support the podcast, we would appreciate it if you go to skeptic.com/donate, make a donation there to whatever extent you can afford. That supports the Skeptic Society in general and this podcast in particular. So thank you for listening, and here's my next guest. Okay. Suzanne Nossel, the new book, Dare to Speak, Defending Free Speech for All. You are one of the most qualified people on the planet, maybe ever, to write about free speech issues, given your background. I will have already read your official biography, but give us a little sense of what it's like to, just to name a few, be the CEO of PEN America, the COO of Human Rights Watch, the executive director of Amnesty International, and you worked for the Obama administration. And let's see, there was a corporate thing in here, business development for Bertelsmann. You've written for the Wall Street Journal and the Washington Post and the LA Times. You have quite the background. Give us a little sense of what it's like to work in these different kinds of industries, for-profit, nonprofit, NGOs, government itself, and then your own organization
Yeah, sure. Well, thank you for having me. I feel like every role I've played, every organization or institution I've been part of is sort of built on one another to work up a skill set that focuses on bridging across differences, on analysis, research, advocacy, initiatives. And so there's actually quite a lot of commonality. I find myself drawing on my business experience, my experience in government and in other nonprofit organizations pretty much daily. And there's a lot of crossover when you're dealing with people, when you're trying to get attention for something, when you're trying to solve a problem. Those skills translate. And I've enjoyed every stint. I've in government found it really gratifying to be part of both the Clinton administration early on in my career and then the Obama administration a bit later on. There's a lot that you can get done. The people are so deeply committed. They're values driven. I love working around the world. I've worked in both of those stints heavily with diplomats at the United Nations, with delegations from all over the world, which I find fascinating. And a lot of that comes up in our work at Penn. We work globally. We work with counterpart organizations in every region of the world. And as the world has become more global, I've been gratified to have a career that's grounded in that. But I've also felt over the last, I'd say 5 or 6 years, really gratified that at Penn, we also work on the United States because so many of the human rights and free expression issues that I'm accustomed to dealing with around the world have come to a head right here at home. And so being able to tackle that as I would say in the last few years, so never has the America in Penn America been so significant as it seems like it is right now.
Yeah, so that's an interesting observation because most of your work defending the rights of speech of authors and speakers and so on has been international. And we've kind of taken it for granted that, of course, we have those rights here. There aren't any big issues here. The worst it ever gets is somebody says something nasty about you on Twitter or something like that. But in fact, the last few years have seen some real rights violations in the area of speech in America. So what do you think has happened in the last, I don't know, let's just say decade or two that has shifted that to our own shores?
I think it's a combination of things. I think political polarization is part of it. We've always had free speech debates have always been bedeviled by hypocrisy. It's always easier to defend the speech rights of those you agree with than those who you abhor. When someone's saying something that's deeply offensive or objectionable to you, that impulse to shut them down is intensified. And so in this polarized climate, we see, for example, in state houses all over the country, dozens of bills introduced and a good number of them passed to curtail political protest rights, the right to assemble and petition government, to conduct a demonstration, all kinds of different restrictions in terms of when you can do it, where you can do it, intensification of punishments if the rules are bent or broken. And that's ideologically driven. We know what the protest movements by and large have been over the last 4 or 5 years. It began with the Women's March, the airport protests, of course, the Black Lives Matter movement. And so, that impulse to use for those in positions of power to use their authority to clamp down on speech with which they disagree, that is a danger that is as old as the millennia. And I think in this polarized climate, we really see it come to the foreground. The other thing I would mention, of course, is social media and how that's transformed our discourse and the weaponization of disinformation and online harassment as unconventional threats to freedom of speech. Freedom of speech advocates kind of historically would focus pretty much exclusively on threats emanating from government legislation to censor. And in this day and age, that remains a serious problem and a worsening problem. We're seeing more and more book banning across the country. We're seeing efforts to ban the teaching of certain subjects in schools. But we also see other kinds of threats to free speech, online harassment that drives people off social media platforms that are useful or even necessities for their professional careers, the flood of disinformation that undercuts the value of our open discourse. I mean, if you can't discern between what is true and what is false, your free speech rights aren't worth as much if you can't actually persuade someone of the point of view you're advocating.
Yeah, you mentioned the banning of teaching of certain ideas here. I've kind of followed the critique of critical race theory being taught in lower schools, all the way down to apparently grammar schools, and then the other side saying, no, 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 that's not critical race theory. Well, whatever you call it, something's being taught there. And, somebody like Chris Rufo, who I follow, he seems to be the go to guy for exposing these documents in schools and in corporations for these so called sensitivity training and racial sensitivity training and so on. And I thought, yeah, this is really good. But then he kind of took the next step and said, here is the list of kind of things that we should by law forbid being taught. And we should use the government to tell teachers what they should and shouldn't teach about critical race theory. And I thought, hang on now, wait a minute. It's one thing to, have your own free speech and say, hey, here's some ideas that are being taught, and I don't think this is a good idea. What do you think? But it's another step entirely to go to the government and say, here's a list of banned topics we want you to, of topics we want you to ban by law. And that seems like a step too far.
Yeah, look, I'm glad to hear you say that because I think there are many people who are deeply concerned with what is being taught in schools. They feel like some of it goes too far, that, their children are being introduced to ideas that may make them feel guilty or worthy of blame for historical phenomenon that happened well before their lifetime. That there is too much emphasis on racial identity to the exclusion of other unifying precepts. And I understand that debate, and I would say I've seen and come across some things that I really scratch my head over and don't understand and don't make sense to me. But to cross over from questioning what is being taught and perhaps casting doubt or offering alternatives to turning to a legislative body to impose a ban on curriculum, on books, on ideas, on even historical explorations is very dangerous, and it's really inimical to the very founding precepts of this country. The idea of the First Amendment that the government cannot impose viewpoint-based restrictions on freedom of speech. That's exactly what these are. And we've at PEN America fought against freedom of speech encroachments from the left and expressed a lot of alarm about what's happening on college campuses and people being far too quick to want to get speakers canceled if they disagree with their views or to insist upon trigger warnings on classroom syllabuses or lists of microaggressions that have to be avoided. And so I've had a lot of concern about sort of diminishing faith and fealty in free speech from the left. But, I think it now just has to be said. What is coming from the right is out and out government censorship. It's next level. And so I think it's really important to keep perspective and recognize that if we are true to the ideals of free speech, these strategies are something that we must reject and come together to reject.
Almost seems like a law of human nature that people just automatically go toward some authority to shut down the speech of people they don't like. This happens on both the left and the right. Now, is this too simple a characterization that it used to be the left, the ACLU, and liberals in the 60s, 70s, 80s, into the 90s defending free speech at all costs, and it was the right that was censorious, obsessively concerned about rock lyrics and Madonna's videos and flag burning and anything that shook the fabric of faith, family, and flag, and so on. And now it's reversed. Now you get your free speech defense from Tucker Carlson on Fox News, and it's the liberals that have become censorious. Is that too simple a characterization of the shift? And what are the complexities in there, if there's any truth to that?
Yeah, no, I think it's more than too simple. It's flat out wrong. I mean, who is introducing censorious bills in dozens of state houses across the country? It's conservatives. Who has introduced all of these anti-protest bills and laws in the very same state houses? it's conservatives. President Trump styled himself as a defender of free speech, but meanwhile was threatening and retaliating against the news media for coverage that he disliked. And so I think it's a very cynical defense of free speech that we see a lot of the time from the right. I absolutely believe there are principled conservatives who are, genuinely believe in free speech, are very worried about what they see from the other side. And I talk to them, and we share a lot of concerns. So that exists. But if you look at what has happened, not just what people say, not just what people call themselves or claim on television, but what is actually happening in legislatures across the country, who is expanding the power of government to ban and punish speech? Right now, it's the conservatives.
Well, so what about all these examples? I was just looking for that list of trigger warnings on the left. That there's a whole laundry list. I had the list of UCLA or University of California system issued that document of hundreds of things that you shouldn't say. But I guess you'd say those are private or at least internal suggestions, not legal laws against speech. Is that the distinction you would make?
Yeah, I think it's an important distinction. I mean, that worries me as well. I think there is one thing we've been talking about for years at Penn is the alienation of a rising generation of young people, predominantly on the left, from the very ideals of free speech, that they see free speech as either irrelevant to or even inimical to the causes that they care about the most, which are maybe racial justice, maybe immigrants' rights, maybe climate justice. And they see free speech as a smokescreen for hatred, as something that's used as a shield to legitimize the menacing of minority groups or those in positions without power. And I talk about this young woman I met, a student activist from the University of Missouri. And when she was asked at one of our events, does it worry you that canceling a campus speaker in the face of protests would violate the First Amendment? She said, the First Amendment's not written for me. And I was sort of taken aback by that, as a former law student, lawyer, this young, very smart woman saying the First Amendment wasn't written for me. And as I talked to her and her peers more, I came to see it was two things that she meant. She's a Black woman. And so part of it was that when the First Amendment was written, her forebears were considered three-fifths of a person. So they weren't actually among those whose rights were being guaranteed around that table. But also that the way she saw free speech being invoked in her own time on campus and in society was almost invariably to defend speech that she found offensive, whether it's, something like build a wall or go back to where you came from. That's the exercise of free speech. But when you hear free speech invoked only in relation to speech, that is denigrating or noxious, you could sort of see why somebody would question whether the First Amendment is relevant for them. So we've done a lot of work educating students about why free speech matters to the left, how it's been the enabler of every social movement, and how those in positions without power have the most to gain from constraining the prerogatives of government to ban and punish speech. So I absolutely think that is a critical area of work, and there's a lot of work to be done on the left. But if your foremost concern is, and I think it should be, if you look around the world, what is the most grave threat to free speech? It's governments, and so those who are now in our own country trying to expand the power of government to police speech, I think need to be and are correctly viewed as the most serious threat right now.
Here's some of those examples. I found that list from the University of California. These are examples of microaggressions. If you ask somebody, where are you from or where were you born, it suggests you're not a true American, or you speak English very well, that you're a perpetual foreigner in your own country, or you're a credit to your race. I can't imagine somebody saying that now, but still, apparently, some people do say that. Or wow, you've become so good at math if you're not Asian. When I look at you, I don't see color. Or there's only one race, the human race. America is a melting pot I don't believe in race. I mean, it's kind of a laundry list of things that I guess students might get offended about. Somebody might be somewhere. But again, I guess your point is that, well, that's just the University of California system. Although it's a state school, it's not the state of California issuing laws. It's just suggestions for what professors and students should or shouldn't say. You're free to ignore it. But on the other hand, because of cancel culture, maybe there's a lot of self-censoring going on and people are afraid to speak or kind of tiptoe on thin ice about what they may and may not say. So they self-censor in the classroom. And that has its own drawbacks.
Yeah, no, I agree. Look, the first chapter of my book, Dare to Speak, is devoted to the idea of being conscientious with language. And I do think living together in our diverse, society of 2021 with no single racial minority, a majority population already among those who are under 18 and moving in that direction for the U.S. population as a whole, that we need to be conscientious of the language that we use with people who are different from us. And I understand why, I think there are big differences between those different statements that you read out. And this is why I really dislike publication of lists that sort of suggest, all these things are the same, or no matter how it's said or what it's said or why. I mean, I was with someone yesterday and, it was in the middle of a conversation and the person has a very slight accent. And at a certain point, she was asked, "Where are you from?" And it was not offensive. She's originally from Cameroon and France. And so she talked about that affects her perspective on the work that we were discussing. It's not necessarily offensive, but if you are talking to someone, and just on the basis of their skin color, you make the assumption that they're sort of from somewhere else. I can understand why somebody who goes through life and is constantly confronted with that question, even though they're in their hometown, their place where they were born, why that would be alienating and make you feel like you're sort of not the norm, and your appearance is striking others as somehow alien. So I think we have to have a level of conscientiousness about this. There's no perfect hard and fast boundary line between when that conscientiousness crosses over into what I think is an unfortunate and unacceptable level of self-censorship, where you really feel like you can't say what you mean, you can't express your ideas or your opinions for fear of the blowback that it might cause. But that's not really the case when you think about most of those things on the items on the list. It's not inhibiting someone from making a point or making an argument. It's just a kind of trigger to conscientiousness and awareness that something that may seem completely innocent to you, that you've been hearing your whole life, could come across differently to somebody who has a different experience, and that is somebody living in a diverse society. It's worth being aware of that.
Yeah. In your book, you discuss the difference between censoring speech by the government or compelled speech. So no one's compelled by these lists by law to say these sorts of things, but we're encouraged culturally, and those cultural forces can be pretty strong. And so again, I guess somebody like Jordan Peterson, who kind of became famous because he stood up to this Bill C-16, which he perceived to be compelled speech, that is, using somebody's preferred pronouns. And he did make it clear, although this seemed to get lost on a lot of people, that if a student said, "Please call me they or sir," or whatever, he would do it because, don't be a dick about it. Just, be nice. But if the Canadian government says, you're in trouble if you don't do this, and furthermore, you may be locked up, it's hard to imagine that would actually happen. Probably many steps in between, but nevertheless, the idea of government compelled speech is concerning.
Yeah, although if you look at that actual, C-16 language, it doesn't even address the use of gender pronouns. Legal analysts who have explored it have said it definitely wouldn't cover the accidental misuse of a pronoun. If somebody was repeatedly, consistently refusing to use another individual's pronoun of choice, that could constitute a form of harassment. I mean, if the purpose for doing it is really to denigrate, to degrade, to sort of call into question the legitimacy of someone's chosen identity, that could be, deeply mean spirited and mocking and, the kind of thing that we would not allow if it were on the basis of race or religion, even now, thankfully, gender. And so, I think it's easy to caricature, but if you actually look at the terms of the law, it's possible it could be misused, but I also think, the intention is to sort of draw a line and create some space for error, for apology, some leeway, but also really hone in on those instances, which obviously do happen, where someone is a kind of weaponizing language in an effort to menace another based on a protected characteristic.
Yeah, my intersection with some of this goes back to the 90s when I was researching my book on Holocaust denial. And I didn't know much about free speech issues around the world. And I was astonished to find out that this is illegal in many European countries, New Zealand, Australia, even Canada, of course, France and Switzerland, and of course, Germany, where denying genocide is a crime. And so I remember when I was interviewing David Irving and talking to him, and all these guys, they're just wrong, 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 and I thoroughly debunked them. But the idea that they could be arrested, Ernst Zundel was a expat living in Canada, and he got arrested. It was a big free speech trial in the late '80s for him. And then when Irving went to Austria to give a speech, he was invited by one of these private groups. I think it was one of these right-wing groups. And, he was arrested at the airport. They had flagged his passport when he went through. And then, he was put on trial for hate speech, but he didn't even give a speech. He was just going to give a speech. So in a way, it's a thought crime. So I wrote a letter to the judge in this case, and on behalf of David Irving, even though I think, his ideas are despicable, not just wrong, but he knows they're wrong, which makes him an unfair player in the world of scholarship. He's not a scholar. He kind of gave that up by doing that. But the idea that somebody could be arrested for this, I was astonished by that, and that hasn't changed much. I think Holocaust denial is still on the books in most of these countries as a crime. Anyway, we're recording this on October 22nd in the middle of the congressional hearings over January 6th. So I wanted to ask you about to what extent speech could be directly, causally connected to violence. We can use the January 6th as an example. Here I usually invoke Hume's counterfactual example of determining causality. The crow, the rooster crows, the sun rises, but if we silence the rooster, the sun rises anyway, so it wasn't the rooster as the cause of the sunrise. You take A out and see if B happens. And in the law, as I understand it, this is the but for, but for this person with a gun, the murder wouldn't have happened. And I can't help but think, I know it's a hard stretch legally, but I can't help but think that but for Trump giving a speech that morning, the insurrection on the Capitol would not have happened. How do you think about that?
Yeah, well, it's interesting. I wrote a piece actually right around the time, shortly after January 6th, arguing that I did not think that President Trump's language in his speech rose to the level of incitement to imminent violence, which is the standard under US law of speech that can be punished. It's a very high standard where you have to make a finding there was advocacy of violence, that violence was imminent, and that people were actually likely to go out and carry out the violent and destructive activities on the basis of what was said. And I actually felt that President Trump, as much as, if you take into account the backdrop and his effort to delegitimize the results of the election and to prevent Vice President Pence from certifying the results, that, in every way, I think he drove forward and caused the events of January 6th to happen. But I actually did not think, looking at the language of the speech that he gave outside the White House that morning, that there was language that equaled incitement to violence. He didn't actually, encourage people to head over to the Capitol and start smashing windows. And as a free speech defender, and a liberal, I was worried that we might see a finding of incitement to imminent violence in the congressional hearings, but when there was still consideration of impeaching him, at the very end of his term, and that, if that finding of incitement to imminent violence on the basis of his language that morning was rendered, that it could create a precedent that would be used to constrict the language of others, even when they hadn't actually said anything in terms of encouraging people to go and carry out violence, but the surrounding circumstances and the context sort of allows you to draw that causal link that you're talking about. And so I worried about how such a precedent might be misused to ban and punish legitimate speech. That's in a legal context. We're now, there are numerous lenses through which his speech and actions have and continue to be evaluated. One is, of course, on social media, whether Facebook was on solid ground in terminating President Trump's privileges, and the Facebook Oversight Board concluded that that they were, that what he had done in terms of delegitimizing the election and calling for action in other settings, that the culmination of all of that was equivalent to and met the definition of incitement as it applies to the platform. Their definition is more like a European definition. It's grounded in international law. As you mentioned a few minutes ago, in international law, there is more leeway to restrict speech. Things like Holocaust denial can be banned and are banned in other democracies around the world, whereas the First Amendment prohibits doing so here. But for Facebook, their reference point is not the First Amendment, their global platform, it's international human rights law. And so a finding that the standard for incitement is met under that definition, I think was fair. And likewise, the conclusions of the January 6th hearings, we don't know yet where they'll wind up, but they are not, at this point, obligated to the legal standard of incitement to imminent violence. And they're able to take a more textured, contextualized approach.
Yeah, those are good arguments, and it remains to be seen. But it's looking more and more like there were a lot of planned groups that had planned to come there days before or even weeks before, and they had their own agenda. So therefore, the but-for argument may not have happened anyway. I mean, all that might have happened regardless of what Trump said, and he didn't say break into the Capitol. Although there is kind of implicit knowledge there, when the boss says, go down there and be strong, people understand what that means. He doesn't have to say, break into the windows. They're stealing your country. They stole the election. Go down there and be strong. Well, we know what the boss means when he says that, right? So, I mean, there is that kind of tacit knowledge.
I think one thing I raised in my piece, and that I think, hopefully will come out through these hearings, is the question of what Trump did know. Because, I actually agree with you. Like, if he knew that people were told to come from across the country, with arms, to be prepared to break down windows, to force their way inside the Capitol, and that was the plan for the afternoon. And, at this point, it seems like probably he may well have known. I think that does change it. I mean, if you know that that's what people are primed to do and you egg them on, I think then finding that even more oblique words might nonetheless meet the standard could be appropriate. You also had Rudy Giuliani that morning saying, this is going to be trial by combat, which I think, was a much more overtly bellicose, warlike statement than what Trump said. So, I think that context, which is taking a lot of time to unearth, we didn't know, I'm glad they're doing the investigation, because it wasn't possible in the days immediately after to know all of the surrounding circumstances.
Well, Bannon's podcast appearance the day before, in which he said all hell is going to break loose tomorrow. It's going to be epic. It's going to be huge. People are coming from around. So obviously he knew there was a lot going on. And he's about as close to Trump as you can get, unless he'd been shut out by then. That remains to be seen. And of course, he doesn't want to have to appear and go under oath to answer those kinds of questions. And, so yeah, that could change the formula. Yeah, I was thinking about this issue again, back to the Holocaust, and I don't want to equate Trump with Hitler at all. He's not Orange Hitler. But, one of the things that David Irving always said was, show me the written document where Hitler says to exterminate the Jews. There's no such thing. I'll give $1,000 to anybody that could do this. He actually had this bet. And Holocaust historians I consulted when I was writing my book, it kind of made this argument that by the time, the Holocaust was getting ramped up, when someone like Hitler, Goebbels, when they said, take care of this problem, the underlings knew what that meant. They meant, go gas them, go kill them. You didn't have to put it in writing. And in fact, one of the reasons they didn't put it in writing was when they were implementing the euthanasia program before the war in the middle 30s, when they were euthanizing and gassing German citizens who were handicapped and mentally defective, as they called them, and so on. That got a lot of bad press. So there was actually a memo from Himmler saying, don't ever put this in writing anywhere. We all know what we're doing. And just, we're just going to talk about it or use it. He didn't use implicit language, but that was the assumption. So I could see where all this could have unfolded without anybody saying, go in there and break through the windows and get in there and hang Pence or whatever. You don't have to say it. If the plans are kind of there and everybody sort of knows it, then all you have to do is say, go down there and be strong, and don't forget to be peaceful. Wink, wink. Again, we don't know, but something like that could have happened.
No, I think that's right. I think, in both instances, though, where you have the underlying violent conduct, that can be the basis of the prosecution. I think in the Trump case, though, and we know what Hitler set into motion, what he was responsible for. So there was no kind of, the fact that, you couldn't find perhaps that written order didn't undercut the culpability when you're, the Führer of a state that's carrying out genocide. In the Trump case, let's face it. I mean, many of us were shocked. Almost the whole country was shocked that this could happen. Didn't imagine, it would go this far. It would be that out of control. Even the Bannon comment, all hell's going to break loose. I think when people heard that, they didn't know what to expect, but nobody quite expected, nobody who was not part of this plan. I think, and obviously the Capitol Police didn't, the members of Congress didn't, Mike Pence didn't, expect it to become the out and out violent mayhem that ensued. And so, it was not the case of a sort of pattern like you see in the Holocaust where, over a long period of time, the same thing is happening over and over again. This was a dramatic escalation. And so, I think that, there's every chance that, it was absolutely deliberately planned and foreseen. And they, there's evidence coming out now that they knew, which doors and windows were less well guarded and where to push in. And, I think that certainly colors the interpretation of the language. One of the things I talk about in the book is the importance of intent and context in evaluating the import of speech. I talk about it oftentimes in the context of, something that seems really offensive, but then when you actually, unpack it and look at what was behind it, may not be. Here is the opposite instance of language that may, on its face, sound rather innocent or measured or like less of an overt call for violence than it might be. But when looked at in full context, as that context is unearthed in investigation, it takes on a different meaning.
Let's talk about why we should let speech like that be heard. That is to say, like Holocaust denial. And the analogy I use is if, let's say I was a historian or archaeologist, a professor in Canada, and I doubted the mainstream view on the genocide of the Native Americans. Whatever the cause, germs, guns, steel, whatever, 90% of them died. Now, let's say, the accepted, I'm just making these numbers up. The accepted population was, let's say, 10 million when Columbus arrived. And I say, no, it was only 1 million. And therefore only 900,000 died, not 9 million died. Am I a Holocaust denier? Am I a genocide denier for challenging those numbers? I may be wrong. I may be an idiot for, my calculations or whatever. But the idea that the Canadian government would say, that's illegal, what you just said, Shermer. This is the accepted number, period, and we're not going to dispute it. Well, you can't have that, because the only way to know what those numbers are is to do the research and have conferences and debates and speeches about what we think happened. And there is kind of the core of your dare to speak. We have to defend people that say things that we think are wrong, or else we won't know if we're wrong.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, I think a lot of accepted wisdom today began as a heresy. Whether you're talking about Galileo, or whether you're talking about, there was a moment where, even in the pandemic, we've seen moments where, our health authorities telling us that masks, don't work, won't protect you, because they're trying to harvest those masks to go to doctors and nurses. So if you contradict that, or you and argue that you ought to get a mask if you can, that should be illegal. I think we need to debate these things. That even a solid fact like the Holocaust, we know that more research reveals new aspects of it. It's never going to disprove it, but the idea that government should dictate the parameters of debate and declare certain ideas, a priori off limits, a prosecutable offense, I think is really problematic. I think that there's just it's what we see from authoritarian governments around the world. In democracies like Canada and Europe, you can understand why they have these laws. The history, in Germany and the determination to reckon with the Holocaust, to accept culpability, to sort of own up, an admirable impulse. And I think Canada now has sort of similar impulse to own up to, what was done with the indigenous population there. And so that is, it's laudable to say, as a government and a country, we want to recognize this. We don't want to hide it or deny it. We've got to take responsibility. That's all correct. But then when it crosses over into, and we're going to punish, anybody who calls it into question, that to me is where you're venturing toward the authoritarian tactics, where you have the Chinese government, and it's not about owning up to, their role in, let's say, the Cultural Revolution, or the internment of the population of Xinjiang. It's about repressing narratives that undercut an official account of events, and the credibility and legitimacy and prestige of the Chinese Communist Party. So if you talk about Taiwan, if you talk about Tiananmen Square, if you talk about Tibet, those are the things that are illegal and much more. And so, to me, there's a continuum. And once you hand to government the power to decide which ideas are off limits and can be prosecuted and punished, that is a power that's liable to be abused. And so I have a strong bias toward our own system and the First Amendment, where that power is denied. And that's why I'm so disturbed by, for example, this effort to ban the teaching of diversity, inclusion, certain ideas about slavery in schools. Let's not open the door to banning speech here in the United States of America.
Yeah, I do find some of that those teaching programs problematic, but nevertheless, I don't think they should be banned. We should just counter them. Well, if the arguments are wrong, why are they wrong? Okay, so I've had a few guests on the podcast that explain why they think they're wrong, and then I get some hate thrown at me for daring to talk to the people. I'll talk to anybody. So let's broaden the idea of hate speech as violence. Okay, leaving aside Trump and January 6th, and just go to the idea that somebody on campus or in a corporation says something nasty. I take it legally the bar is set very high before you would prosecute somebody for violence for just what they said, or what does it take for their words to be translated into violence? In other words, tell us a little bit about the subtleties of just saying, well, the solution to hate speech is more speech, but that's not always that simple.
Yeah, look, a couple things. I mean, I devote a whole chapter in the book to an examination of the harms that can result from speech. I think free speech advocates historically have been reluctant to cop to the notion that speech can cause harm. It goes back to that old schoolyard adage: "Sticks and stones may break my bones, but names will never hurt me." Which is a good thing probably to instill in your kids. But the fact is that speech can hurt and wound and harm, and particularly, I cite research in the book that looks at people who've been on the receiving end of slurs and stereotyping and bigotry their whole lives, and how that can affect mental health, psychological well-being, academic performance, even physical health. And so I think that defense of free speech is more credible if we acknowledge that you can't just wish away these harms and pretend, it really doesn't matter, that someone is, being bullied and demeaned, by their peer groups, by colleagues, by people out on the street. You have to acknowledge that causes genuine harm. I don't think the answer to that harm is intensified government, and expanded government power to police speech. I think that, as we, were touching on a moment ago, carries its own risks and dangers. But I think as citizens, we have an obligation to address hateful speech as a societal scourge, and to discourage it, and to reinforce norms of mutual respect and civility, and understanding of differences. And there are taboos that operate that I think are kind of healthy and necessary against, for the use of degrading slurs, for example. We all sort of grew up learning, there's certain things you don't say, and sometimes those taboos change. Language changes. A term that was considered acceptable, I talk about the term Oriental that used to be used for a long time to talk about Asian Americans, and then at a certain point, it became kind of offensive, and you had to internalize that and stop using it. Now we've all stopped using it, and nobody thinks about it anymore. And it's not. It doesn't feel like self-censorship, because language evolves and moves forward. And so, in my view, it's important to acknowledge those harms. At the same time, I also devote a chapter to I think the danger of equating speech to violence. And, that's something that we started to hear more and more of in recent years. The idea that, your offensive speech equals an act of violence. And to me, that opens the door to a number of different dangers. If my words to you, what I say about you, my insult, it equals an act of violence, why are you then not justified in response and punching me in the nose? If my act was violence, can't you, maybe it's self-defense to punch me in the mouth and stop me from saying anything else. If speech is violence, can the government meet it with violence? If a march, about Black Lives Matter, and the chanting about police, it can be seen as tantamount to violence. Why aren't the police then justified in clamping down on that with violence? So I think that's a very dangerous and fallacious analogy. But where does it originate? Well, it's interesting. In Toni Morrison's Nobel Prize for Literature acceptance speech, she actually says words are violence. And I think what she meant is that at the time, when she was writing in the 1990s, that there was not enough recognition of the power of words to wound and cause harm. That people didn't understand it. That they, had convinced themselves that words are just words and they ought to just roll off your back, and that their negative consequences are not to be taken seriously. And she, I think, wanted to call that into question and sort of sound an alarm and say, no, it's more grave and serious than you think, and we need to be more cognizant of the power of words. And I really agree with that. So I think she was using it kind of hyperbolically to say that words are violence, but I think her essential point that words can cause harm obviously is one that I agree with, and think needs to be part of how we think about free speech.
Yeah, you mentioned Richard Spencer in your book, the punch a Nazi meme that happened after that. In my opinion, Richard Spencer is just a racist asshole. He's a dick. But the guy who punched him, that's the crime. You can't do that. It's not a crime to be a racist asshole and spout a bunch of nonsense about Jews and blacks and so on, which he does. And so there's the actual difference. It can't be that they're all the same. We have to be able to think in shades of gray, on continuums rather than binaries, as a spectrum, if you want to think of it like that. I think that's the issue. So then, like, one of the counters I've been getting my criticisms online about Trump and the January 6th insurrection is the, tu quo is, well, BLM and Antifa are just as bad. Look what they did. And the left doesn't want to do anything about that, or the left endorses it, or the Democrats say that's okay. How do you think about the difference between protests like that and then what happened on January 6th, or what are the comparisons there?
I think violence in any context should be rejected and condemned, and that it's not an exercise when a protest turns violent, when people bring guns, with the intent of and the expectation of potential violence, or when people are disorderly and they get into violent malaise, that is not an act of free speech. But I do think it's categorically different when there is a concerted attack on the institutions of government in an effort to impede the certification of a democratic election. I mean, that was a direct, one thing is, protests in the street that, turn tumultuous and get out of hand. That's going to happen from time to time, even in a stable democracy. But an attack on, that fundamental function of government, the orderly and peaceful succession, which never, in our nearly 250-year history as a country has been undermined in that way, with the exception of the Civil War. That to me was something fundamentally much more disorderly, much more threatening to the pillars of our society. And, and I think, we're grappling with that. It reflects a sentiment that is, completely at odds with the responsibilities of our democratic citizenry to respect the outcomes of elections and transfer power in a orderly and constructive way. So, I think the notion that one is justified by the other is just completely spurious.
Yeah. So a way to think about it might be that if a Antifa protest breaks out into violence and then the mob breaks into a CVS and fills their bags with toothpaste and other goodies on the shelves and so on, those are local lawbreakers that should be prosecuted by the city or the state, not a federal issue. And it's quite separate from what happened on January 6th, which is something entirely different than just breaking local laws. Is that a way to think about it?
I think that's part of it. I think, you also have the fact that whether it was technically incitement or not, you had the president of the United States egging these people on, and that's not something that happened with looters who, descended on a CVS. And, it also bears mentioning, I think it's really important to say, overwhelmingly, the Black Lives Matter protests of the summer of 2020 were peaceful. I mean, there were a few, and I live in New York, and there's a lot of concern. There was one night of kind of, where a few stores were broken into and kind of ransacked, and then shop owners across the city started boarding up their stores. It was quite kind of harrowing to be here during that time. But honestly, nothing else happened. Like, thankfully, after that one night, and it was a couple of stores, things were quiet. And in most cities across the country, those protests were overwhelmingly peaceful. So I think it's important not to. Yes, there were looters and situations that got out of hand and people that resorted to violence, but overwhelmingly, that was not the tone of those protests.
How legally do you draw the line with libel and slander? So that's not hate speech; it's an actual crime. But at some point, there's speech that's made. I claim that you're an embezzler, or I say publicly you're an embezzler. Well, embezzlement is a crime, but my speech is not. And then who's the burden of proof on to prove that I lied and that. And legally, you have to show that I knew that it was a lie. I know that you're not an embezzler, but I said it anyway. And that's where you draw the line for the crime. Explain a little bit how that works.
Yeah, I mean, here in this country, we have very strict standards for defamation and libel, where you do have to know that what you are saying, the person, in order to sustain a claim that they have been libeled, has to prove that the person who is accused knew that the claim was false. And that's to protect against libel and defamation claims that could come kind of fast and furious for any sort of garden variety insult, or an exchange of views that gets heated and nasty. And so it's really meant to hone in on more deliberate, kind of purposeful efforts to impugn someone else's reputation. And it's very difficult to succeed with a libel claim here in the United States. In Britain, the laws are substantially more liberal, and there's people sort of talk about British libel law for that reason, and you have to be a lot more careful about what you publish here. And President Trump, early on in his term, talked about trying to change the laws. He felt he was being degraded and denigrated, and wanted to explore a change in the law, which I think alarmed a lot of First Amendment advocates.
Yeah, I was again reminded of the Holocaust denial trial where David Irving sued Deborah Lipstadt for calling him a Holocaust denier, which is interesting because I've always called him a Holocaust denier, but I think he liked me and he does, and I'm not Jewish and she is, and he didn't like her. And, so people sue over those kinds of things that are emotionally driven. Nevertheless, she had to prove in England that she didn't libel him. So that's a little bit harder. And then there's a climax toward the end of the trial where they're showing that, he's not just incompetent, but he's incompetent in a certain direction. All his errors are all in the direction of exonerating the Nazis and so forth. And then there was a whole, segment of the trial about his anti-Semitic views and his racist views. And, they had examples from his own journal, his diary, and so forth. And then the judge says, because they're trying to show that it was his anti-Semitism driving his historical errors in this particular direction. And then the judge says, but what if he actually believes it? That is, what if the things he spouts, he actually thinks that this is the way Jews are and this is the way blacks are. So it's not some kind of overt thing. It's just that's part of who he is. How can you still then hold him accountable that he knew this was wrong and he falsified the historical record anyway? So in America, so the laws are different, but nevertheless, if somebody really, if Richard Spencer really does believe that blacks and Jews are a certain way, and it's one thing for me to say, well, he's wrong, but if he actually believes it, then he's not libeling
Well,
or
that's why we
slandering.
have sort of, the reasonable person standard, where you can't just have completely fallacious, baseless, singular beliefs. We're not going to adjust the law for, every psychological malady that might lead you to, believe in whether it's space aliens or, false cures, quackery. We have a reasonable person standard, and if your belief is not reasonable, that's not going to be a defense.
I wanted to ask you about cancel culture and social media. Let's go down two branches. One, what should we do about social media companies and so on, and Section 230, and then also if you've offended somebody, how should you apologize? So let's just take the first branch. How do you think about social media companies? Are they like the telephone company, or are they like the New York Times as a publisher, and they should screen everything that they print and be responsible for it?
The problem is neither is anywhere near an exact analogy. they exercise far more discretion and control over content than does Verizon or AT&T, and far less than does the New York Times or Penguin Random House. And it's that in-between state that is what makes them what they are. The fact that you can communicate instantaneously, that nothing goes through an editor. There's not someone who has to decide whether to publish your latest Facebook post. That's the power of it, the immediacy of it, the organic nature of it. And it's also the case that if they were not to moderate at all, that the platforms would be cesspools and just filled with vitriol and nude imagery and terrorist recruitment and all sorts of other things that are harmful to society and really undermining to any redeeming value that these platforms have. And so, that's why it's difficult. There's no kind of simple answer. Oh, you can just put it in category, number 3, and that, can dictate a effective regulatory approach. This is a real struggle to sort of come to grips with the power of these technologies for good and for ill. Try to understand what different forms of regulation, what their consequences will be, and that's something that is hotly debated. The concerns that I've been expressing throughout this conversation about the power of government to police speech and how that can go wrong, it absolutely applies to social media. And so I'm leery of, just the notion of regulation. It's a question of what regulation. I think there's some regulations that would be valuable. For example, the companies now, Facebook in particular, thwarting the efforts of serious researchers to look into what's happening on the platform, denying them access to data, giving them data that's false or corrupted, withholding data sets that they have previously made accessible. I think that's something that's an area where regulation might be appropriate to require more transparency and force the platforms to be more forthcoming. I think other forms of regulation dictating how content is moderated would really get government into a realm of policing of speech that we've always been really hesitant to do, and the First Amendment forecloses.
Yep. Suzanne, tilt your screen down just a tiny bit there, because we're kind of like this on Magic. There we go. Perfect. Yeah, I was just thinking about this, in terms of the capability of screening content. Something like the New York Times gets, I don't know, like 100 submissions for an op-ed a day. Maybe they publish 2 and they fact check them and so on. No problem. They got the staff to do that. But I forget the numbers you put in your book. But how many tweets are there an hour? Like 1 million an hour, and Facebook postings like 5 million a day, or I don't know what. How could they possibly do it? So they have algorithms. Yeah. So they have algorithms. The problem with the algorithms is they're not that good, and just they're looking for trigger words. So like the publisher of my next big book on conspiracies, Johns Hopkins University Press, they were just telling me yesterday that we have to be very careful about the title and subtitle of the book, because if we put words in there like QAnon or rigged election that we're debunking, that we may get screened out because it's the wrong words. We use the bad words. And even if I said something like, the title of my book is Why Anti-Semitism is Wrong, or Why White Supremacy is Evil, I may get banned because the word white supremacy is in the book title. So therein lies the problem with the algorithms.
No, it's true. And there are cases where, for example, a terrorist is banned from a platform, and you're not allowed to advocate support for example, PKK terrorist on Facebook, but posts. There's supposed to be an exception on Facebook when it comes to advocacy for that person's rights in prison. If you're complaining about their prison conditions, that they're being mistreated, that's something that should be permitted on the platform. But Facebook managed to forget about that exception. It got buried for a couple of years. Their content moderators were never told about it. And so those posts were taken down. And it is, there's just not enough space for nuance, or I don't know that our artificial intelligence systems will ever be able to encompass the kind of nuance it takes to responsibly sort of moderate and manage our discourse. And even human beings, like these rules are incredibly complex. You're dealing with such a broad range of subject matter. There are language differences, there are cultural nuances, there are, words have different meanings in different settings, even if the language is the same. And so it's incredibly complex. I mean, the social media platforms are always complaining, like, it's impossible for us to do this at scale. The fact is they're as big as they are, and I think they have to invest vastly more resources into trying to get this right. I mean, one of the biggest problems in my view is that they do not view users as customers. Their customers are advertisers because the services are free. And so users are just, human traffic and eyeballs that makes the advertising revenue possible. And I think that, with given the level of influence that these platforms have over our society and democracy, I think that way of thinking needs to shift, and that they need to look at users as customers and to offer customer service of the kind that we're accustomed to in just about every other industry, where if something goes wrong, if you're for example, you had your book and you had QAnon in the title, and your publisher was worried that it could get banned on Facebook, if you knew that you would have a recourse in that instance, and that there was a number you could call, maybe even
Yeah.
to let them know ahead of time, hey, listen, this is coming out, and I want to make sure it's not caught in your filters, then you wouldn't have to worry about it.
Yeah, but there's nothing like that now. I
But
mean,
that doesn't
trying to
exist.
trying to contact Facebook or Twitter or whatever is like trying to contact the IRS. Forget it. I got to get somebody on the phone. Probably the IRS would be easier. um, yeah. So let's say you've said something on Twitter, Facebook, whatever, and then you regret it. I mean, let's say you said something really nasty, and then you get mobbed and shamed and so on. What should you do? What should people do? Obviously, you have a great section on apologies in there, and something like "I'm sorry you're such a snowflake that my words hurt you" is not a good apology. How do you recommend it
No.
when people screw up that you come clean about it?
Yeah, and I talk about how to apologize in a way that, comes across as sincere and that takes account of, what you've done wrong, that is attentive to the sensibilities of whoever has been offended, that's cognizant of, if it was a matter of ignorance or cluelessness, cognizant of the need to become more educated. And, I think there's a way to get it right. We've seen, some apologies just in recent weeks, where people have stumbled a bit. I think, in, for example, there was a professor who showed a music professor who showed the Laurence Olivier version of, I think, King Lear, and where he's in blackface, and the students found it very offensive. And sort of in the apology, uh, the professor, talked about sort of having black friends and that he's not racist. And, it just kind of came across as tone deaf, as opposed to, sorry, it was Othello, of course. It came across as sort of tone deaf and defensive, and, kind of intensified what was already a tense situation. It was, it was something that was done, uh, not with certainly no intent to offend, but perhaps a bit of a lapse of conscientiousness and not recognizing that in 2021, to show a film, where the central character is acting in blackface is not going to be well received among, in this day and age.
Yeah, so there was this documentary film on Netflix, The Social Dilemma, that I've been complaining about because to me it makes it seem like social media companies are way more powerful than I think they are. But maybe I'm an okay boomer and I just don't get it because I don't really use Facebook much and just a little bit on Twitter and they got the guy on Social Dilemma, Tristan Harris, I think it was, that invented the like button or something, and he was self-flagellating like he was J. Robert Oppenheimer, invented nuclear weapons, and that this was, an existential threat to, to society and so on. To me, it just seems exaggerated. But maybe if I was a 15-year-old in high school and my whole life revolved around my Facebook friends, and people were saying nasty things that were really quite hurtful, maybe I'd have a different view on that. So, how do you think about the power of social media? regardless of what the government
You know,
should be.
I think it's undeniable. I mean, and I do think it's sort of hard to judge if you're not on these platforms, and I'm not on it the way a lot of people are, but I do sort of partake, and I have my own lens, and then I deal with it professionally. And you know, in some parts of the world, Facebook is the equivalent of the internet. You know, for example, in Myanmar, you know, most people do most of their communicating and connecting, you know, not through email platforms or websites, but through Facebook. And you know, I was in the West Bank over the summer, and writers there who I was meeting with said Facebook is a primary publishing platform for them. They don't have the sort of literary journals and websites that writers in the United States have. And so they publish on Facebook. And it's an incredibly important way for them to get their work out, to connect with other writers, to build up an audience. You know, I have teenage children, and I see for them, you know, how it affects and governs their social life. You know, it's obsessive, it's definitional, it's sort of, you know, in the world of our childhoods, you know, our sort of teen magazines and television and movies, you know, all rolled up into one and always on, always with us. You know, virtually the way they live, kind of impossible to turn off. So, you know, that's one of the reasons why I think it's so important to continue to experiment and try to get this question of content moderation right. I think some people sort of conclude, you know, the answer is just to, you know, some uh, uh, fantasy that these services can just be turned off, or you know, I'll cancel my Facebook account and then I'm just sort of washing my hands of it, and that's that. You know, the fact is, you know, I think what's compelling and even valuable about these services is here to stay, and so the trick is trying to preserve those aspects while getting some of the worst harms under control.
Right. So if we're in agreement that we don't want the government to come in and tell Facebook what they can and cannot screen. So then we're looking for market solutions. And so why aren't there six Facebooks or at least two or three and or you know five Twitters or whatever? How come the market hasn't solved this problem? Is it that we always end up with these kind of duopolies, or there's only one or two that because they have such a market head start, no one can possibly, no matter how much money, even a Peter Thiel couldn't, you know, put in $100 million and compete with Facebook or whatever it would be?
Yeah, look, I mean, I don't know if I have a full explanation. I think a couple things bear mentioning. I mean, one is Facebook, you know, and other platforms like Google have been incredibly aggressive in their acquisitions, snapping up, you know, competitors like Instagram, like WhatsApp, you know, when they're germinating, and being very forward looking in terms of rolling up those services and you know, bringing those competitive capabilities under a single tent. I think antitrust authorities have now woken up to that. I don't think it's going to be easy for them to do it going forward, but they've already gotten so you know, gargantuan that, and it's also, there's not really an antitrust theory, I don't think, that I've heard that would allow the government to unscramble those eggs, you know, and for example, to you know, force the breakup of these companies. I mean, maybe that is possible, but I haven't heard that theory yet, because the ways in which they're monopolistic are so different than the traditional antitrust violators that, you know, led to the evolution of the law, where it really had to do with raising prices. You know, of course, for consumers, these services are free, so that's not the problem. So that's one piece of it, and then you know, I think it's the you know, it's the nature of the services that, you know, what is compelling about it is that everybody is there, and so alternatives where, you know, you could sort of break off and go to a different service, you know, that's great, and you could, but if your friends are not there, you know, it's not it's going to be lonely. It's not the conversation you want to have. It's not that, you know, it's there's also not, you know, for those writers in the West Bank, there's not the chance of reaching, you know, potentially hundreds or thousands of people. And so, you know, I think those are at least two of the reasons. You know, there were earlier on, there were different services that kind of came and went, like MySpace. You know, now we see like the rise of TikTok, which is by far the most popular among young people. We see reports that Facebook is worried because their mainstay service has an aging audience, and even Instagram, which they bought in order to reach a younger audience, seems like it's losing some steam. And so, this may not be a permanent condition.
Right, but the call for government intervention seems stronger, especially with the whistleblower on 60 Minutes last week talking about the profit motive in Facebook, and that the algorithms drive these stories. That the more radical or hateful the stories, the more eyeballs they get, the longer they stay up, the more money they make. They know this is going on, then that would be an argument for intervention, government intervention.
Well, that's a question, whether this algorithmic power that prizes engagement and seems to play off, a kind of a human instinct that is, just hardwired into us, which is, that which makes us angry, sucks us in more deeply. And, our passions lead in some dangerous directions, and all what the services do, they amplify those human passions, and they kind of look at how those passions ignite in the abstract across big population groups, and they make the assumption that if sort of people like you are motivated by this and curious about this conspiracy theorist, maybe you are too. And here we'll introduce you to a post by him or a video of him, and perhaps you'll like it. And it's not that they've chosen that to present to you. It's just that they have machine learning that shows that sort of people like you are going to spend a lot of time engaging with that content. And so it's sort of weaponized human psychology and instinct in a way that is fascinating. And it's how you curb that without getting rid of some of what is pleasurable. And I think healthy and functional about Facebook is when you're celebrating something, there's a new baby, there's a birthday, those posts also get a lot of engagement, and people chime in and they're congratulating someone on their new job or their move, and it can feel very affirming, and you feel connected. You've heard from all these people about your birthday, and it's it's sort of the same algorithm that has made that happen. And so how can you tweak these algorithms so that on the positive side that still exists, and the unhealthy stuff is curtailed. And I can understand why that's not simple, and I also have concerns about how government would regulate that. What law would you exactly pass to address that problem?
Right, right. Yes, it's a difficult one. I was very conflicted when the social media companies kicked off Alex Jones, the conspiracy theorist, who was so far out there. He just can't possibly have believed half the stuff he was saying. That the government's being run by multidimensional alien beings and this kind of stuff. I mean, he just knows he's just bullshitting to get eyeballs and so on. And then on the side, he's selling all these supplements because he has all these young people following him and whatnot. And then, but then, a lot of his followers, when he went off on the Sandy Hook conspiracy theory that this never happened, this was all fake, and these were fake, crisis actors and so on. And then his followers showed up at the homes, the parents of these slain children, and they sued him and so forth. And there it seems like the speech did, I don't know if you'd call that violence. I mean, showing up at somebody's home to harass them in their private home, that's a kind of violence, I guess. And there it seemed like that was a reasonable move to make. And yet I was still like, I don't like this guy at all, but to take away his voice, he's free to create his own platform, I guess, but no one will even host it. So I know that's one of those difficult cases.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think it is legitimate for these platforms to decide sort of what kind of platform they want to be. I mean, I would feel better about that if there were more of them, if it was less consolidated, if they didn't function in some ways as a modern version of the public square, where so much of our political discourse is happening on Twitter and Facebook, that I think they assume certain obligations of a public realm, even though they are private companies. And so that's why I think it's important that they've embraced principles like freedom of speech. But I also recognize, I don't think these platforms should be subject to the First Amendment. If they were subject to the First Amendment, it would be, they actually would disappear. We would lose what's valuable about them. I think because it would be so noxious and putrid, and there'd be so many, scammers and, uh, pornographers polluting the platforms that nobody would want to be there anymore. And so they have to police. I don't think having, say, white supremacist or virulently anti-Semitic, or Islamophobic content on the platforms is something that they should be obligated to do if that goes against their own values. I don't think our government could dictate that. They're required to keep that content up, and so, that's the question. What's the boundary line for someone like Alex Jones, where there was, demonstrable harm and trauma, certainly to those families who endured, years of him. You talk about Holocaust denial and how pernicious that is. Denying an incident like Sandy Hook, where that was had so many eyewitnesses, and so it was so incredibly traumatic to those affected. Is something similar. I don't think it should be legally banned, but I don't think there's an entitlement to be able to promote that falsehood on any particular platform.
Yeah, good to make that distinction between your right to speak versus you're entitled to speak. And so, when Milo Yiannopoulos goes to a college campus and he gets shouted down, the heckler's veto and so forth, that's one thing. But campuses are not required to bring Milo Yiannopoulos to campus. And therefore, his voice is not being censored because he's not getting invited.
No, that's right. I mean, where censorship comes in is when he's invited, for example, say the Campus Federalist Society invites him, and then the university, people protest, and the university administration, with demands that invitation be withdrawn. That is where the censorship can come in. But if he doesn't get that invitation in the first place, which nowadays he's not, if you notice, Richard Spencer and Milo Yiannopoulos are no longer doing they're not getting invited anymore. And so, and then there's some campuses where you can book a room, where anybody can book a lecture hall or an auditorium for a speech. And if it's a private university, then they can't discriminate on the basis of viewpoint. But I think a lot of the universities have sort of changed their rules in that regard. You do have to secure an invitation. Because the problem is, of course, it's so difficult to distinguish, especially on social media, what the nature of an appearance is. You get invited by the Federalist to speak at UC Berkeley, and you send out a video saying, I spoke at UC Berkeley, and that's a prestigious platform and podium to be behind, and nobody knows exactly how it happened or what the role of the administration was, and it can come off as a kind of endorsement, even when it's nothing of the sort.
Yeah, I remember that film that Ben Stein made called Expelled, about how intelligent design theory is being expelled from college campuses. It's censored. Everybody's so afraid of this. And the film opens with this scene where he's at Pepperdine University in this auditorium. Well, I'm an alumni. I went there and I recognized the auditorium. And so I contacted somebody there and I said, you guys didn't used to teach creationism. What's going on? Why'd you have Ben Stein there? He said, we didn't. He just rented the hall. I went, oh. Okay.
Yeah, exactly. That is, it's a good example.
So what do you recommend to college students, administrators, faculty, if Milo Yiannopoulos or Charles Murray or whoever is coming to your campus? How should they respond?
I actually think that, rather when Milo and Richard Spencer first started to try to do these campus tours and elicit these invitations, their goal was to be shut down. Their goal was to get the invitation from the college Republicans and kind of dare the administration to get it called off, so that if they were silenced, they could go and grandstand and file a lawsuit and reach out to their supporters for donations and grab headlines. And that worked for a little while, and we got very involved and put out a report on campus free speech, in which we counseled to do the opposite, actually to let them come, let them speak, allow counter protesters to, have their say too, and have a place to demonstrate and express their views, ensure safety, and get through it, because then it's over. And, there's no big headline. I mean, if, Milo Yiannopoulos gives a talk, in front of 75 people, that's actually not a story. And so,
Right.
you're playing into his hands if you shut them down. And, universities got wise, and they actually began to do that. And, that's why those tours fizzled out.
Yes, I remember watching those unfold, and Milo and his team would go in there days before and post these posters that said, snowflakes, run for your dorms. Milo Yiannopoulos is coming, just kind of egging them on. And so I was posting on Twitter because I've done a lot of public speaking. What public speakers hate more than anything else is a half empty or empty room, right? So if you really want to hurt Milo, just don't go. I mean, he would be crushed,
Exactly.
right? The last thing he wants is a happy crowd. He wants the protesters. But of course, he's different than someone like if you brought in a George Will or sort of a Liz Cheney or somebody like that to speak, a principled conservative who just wants to talk about their values that they deeply hold. They're not there to own the libtards or anything like that. So if it was somebody like that, maybe I think. Well, here's your list. I'll just kind of rattle through it because it's so good here of how you should respond. So you said this is assuming you want students want to go. You can walk out. You can turn your back. Signs and banners. Protest loudly outside the hall. Silent gestures. I'm not sure what those would be. Maybe the jazz hands now or something. Posing tough questions. Intermittent heckles. Satirical costumes or images. Something like that.
Right. I mean, those are examples I give in the book of ways to protest without silencing that don't involve shouting the person down, so that no one who has come to hear the speech has the opportunity to do so. And, even though censorious protests, loud protests that drown out a speaker are technically an act of free speech, I find them troubling, because in exercising your free speech, you're impairing that of another. And so, one of my effort in the book was to pull together these examples that you just cited of ways in which you can have a very effective, evocative, even headline-grabbing protest, but without interfering with the speech rights of others.
Okay, and last big point here in your book, you talk about what I wanted to have you expand on this a little bit, because inequality is such a huge subject in the national conversation now. You make a distinction between formal equality and substantive equality. Formal equality, you write, is the belief that to achieve fairness, people must be treated the same way at all times, regardless of individual background or circumstance. Substantive equality, you say, is the belief that because individual situations can differ vastly, in order to achieve equal opportunities or results, it may be necessary to adjust for those differences, and in some cases treat people distinctly in order to foster great equality as an outcome. Man, that's a can of worms there. That's a huge subject, but since you include that in your book, how do you think about that in the context of free speech?
A couple of things. I mean, I think a lot about not just government impingements on free speech, but also the enablers of free speech, and really who has an opportunity to take part in our marketplace of ideas. If you believe in the underlying theory of free speech, that the more robust our discourse is, the more voices you have, the more likely it is that the best ideas will rise to the top, and that truth will prevail, falsehoods will be exposed. In the basic functioning of a marketplace of ideas, then barriers to entry are impediments to the health of that marketplace. If there are people who are shut out because of lack of education, because of racial bias, gender bias, they can't get a publishing contract, they can't enter the field of journalism, they can't build an audience for their podcast, then those are voices that are missing. And so in our work at PEN America, we devote a lot of attention to trying to enable lesser heard voices. We have a big program that's focused, for example, on the rights, the writing of the incarcerated, people who are in American prisons, and how to get their voices out. We do a program with young, undocumented dreamers, young students, to enable them to be part of the public conversation. We have an Emerging Voices program that's devoted to aspiring writers from non-traditional backgrounds who would otherwise be locked out of the literary community. So I think we have to pay attention to those enablers. We have to pay attention to power disparities in who has a voice. We have to go out and seek out voices that may be excluded from the conversation. If you're writing something about a group that is not your own, that may be less powerful, involving people from that group and helping make sure you get it right. So I think there's a lot you can do to try to take into account, what I talk about is sort of trying to ensure that the exercise of free speech rights doesn't reinforce inequalities. And I think, those are some of the ways that I advocate doing that.
Yeah, so then that gets us to the troubling subject of the difference between what you might call real racism, where there are still racists who think these bad thoughts and sometimes express them, versus systemic racism or institutional racism, where any difference between any groups is assumed to be due to racist attitudes or just historical racism, even if the people at the moment are not themselves racist. So how do you think about what should be done about that?
I think part of it is just discussion and understanding and looking at the ways. I've learned a lot about how race and racism inflects aspects of our society where, I may never have thought about it before. Things like where our highways are positioned, in what neighborhoods they cut through, or, why it is that living on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, our subway is an actual subway underground. And then there are other parts of the city where it's still above ground, sort of rattling past people's windows and shading the street. So, to me, it's a lens. It's, critical race theory is a lens through which to look at our society. It's not the only lens. It's not the definitive lens, but, it can be like sort of an eye-opening lens. And so, I think even though as you point out at the beginning of the conversation, it's a red herring to say that this debate right now about what's being taught in schools is about critical race theory, because critical race theory is not actually being taught. It's a label that it's been ascribed to, all sorts of curricula dealing with issues of racial injustice or diversity and inclusion. But, even when it comes to actual critical race theory, it's like, I wouldn't say I subscribe to it per se, but when I learned about it in law school, I thought, this is interesting. Like, this is just something to understand, and there's a certain, logic here. There are probably some things I would disagree with, but it can be part of our education. Just another thing that we kind of encompass in our worldview, like many other theories and ideas. And I think sort of the more the better, and that the idea of singling out one as dangerous and even illegal, is just terribly constricting.
So there's been much discussion about the conservative U.S. Supreme Court and Roe v. Wade. How do you think about the future of laws protecting free speech could shift, or are you worried about that with a conservative Supreme Court? Are there cases coming up that could be decisive?
Yeah, I would say what's somewhat reassuring is, there still remains this like titular fealty to the idea of free speech among kind of traditional conservatives. They don't want to be seen as betraying the cause of free speech. That could change. I wouldn't take that for granted. And there has been this sort of elevation of corporate speech rights, in a way that has been used to curtail the rights, the ability of a government to speak out in its own name. And so I find that to be a troubling trend. It's something that Justice Elena Kagan has called out.
Yeah, I think you're right on that. The historical trend since, say, Schenck versus the United States in 1919 when Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes made his famous line about a clear and present danger of falsely shouting fire in a crowded theater. The problem with that is that once you set that bin up, you could throw almost anything in there that the government might think is a clear and present danger, including draft protesters, which is what that was about, which now seems rather quaint since that's such an American thing to do now. I'm going to end our conversation reading your final page here. The distinct rationales for free speech are interlacing. It is individual autonomy that allows for the free thought that can expose falsehoods and uncover truths. Instantiation of civic courage is what makes possible the kinds of open political deliberations that democracy requires. Different rationales for free speech may have greater or lesser resonance, depending on whether you are a scientist, a member of a fringe political party, an artist, a scholar, or a journalist. We don't all have to be in complete agreement about why free speech must be defended, as long as these and other arguments in totality convince us that it must be defended. Absolutely. Perfectly put, Suzanne. I'm so grateful for your work and your book. What's next on your writing plate or issues that you're dealing with on your job?
So many. I mean, I've been writing about what's happening around the world and the rise of authoritarianism. The forcing of so many great writers and journalists into exile, about China and Chinese influence in the West. So it's a busy docket. Great to talk with you, Michael. Thank you so much.
All right, Suzanne. All right.
Take care. Have
Thank
a great
you so much.
weekend. Bye-bye.